Welcome to the 307th Bombardment Group Association Korean War History blog. I'm Dr. James Blackwell, your Korean War historian. This blog series will present you with highlights of what is in the historical record, but our intent is not to publish the definitive history of the 307th and the Korean War. What we want to do is stimulate your recollections of what happened to you during this time. Then share some of those with us so that we can preserve the memory of your service to the nation. Ernest Hemingway, the great novelist, was also something of a historian. He had himself experienced the reality of war. He wrote, "A writer's job is to tell the truth. His standard of fidelity to the truth should be so high that his invention out of his experience should produce a truer account than anything factual can be. For fact can be observed badly, but when a good writer is creating something, he has time and scope to make it of an absolute truth." You were there in Korea. My expectation and hope is that you will complete the record where it has blanks and correct the record where it is wrong. That's why this is a blog, not a history. So post your experiences in response. We will collect them and make them available to our members to share. Add your questions. We'll do our best to find answers in the record. The Long Rangers of the 307th Bombardment Group returned victorious from World War II. The unit was inactivated at Camp Stoneman, California in January 1946. The entire United States military was demobilizing. By that summer, the Army Air Corps shut down all but 2 of its 125 bombardment groups. The Soviet Union, our ally in the war to defeat Hitler, soon made it clear they were not going to do likewise. They kept 100 Army divisions in Europe. And they kept 3 of the 4 U.S. B-29s that had made emergency landings in the Soviet Union during the war, as they set out to reverse engineer this aircraft for themselves. The B-29 was far superior to anything the Soviets had at the time. It was the only aircraft capable of reaching the Soviet Union from U.S. air bases with an atomic bomb. The Russians were racing to catch up with the United States to build a fleet of strategic bombers that they could use to attack the United States. The Soviets set up puppet governments in their occupied territories, and in March 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent of Europe. The United States was forced to rearm to prevent Europe from being taken over for a third time in the 20th century by an evil tyrant who was determined to extend an empire across the Atlantic. Joseph Stalin was speeding ahead to develop his own atomic bomb and a bomber that would keep the United States out of Europe entirely. In response, the United States created the Strategic Air Command in March 1946, and it activated the 307th Bombardment Group that August at MacDill Air Base in Tampa, Florida. In the beginning, the 307th was to develop sea search and anti-submarine warfare tactics, techniques, and procedures with the B-29, as it had done with previous aircraft at the beginning of World War II at MacDill. By the summer of 1947, the 307th was a full contributor to SAC's so-called goodwill flights to Western Europe. The U.S. flew a squadron at a time of B-29s to land in Germany, then operate out of bases there to fly over friendly countries in Western Europe. They went into the Mediterranean and even into Saudi Arabia as well. These missions, publicized as ways to generate support from Western Europeans, were in fact exercises to provide U.S.-based crews training with long-range overseas flights and familiarization with the areas in which they might soon have to operate. They also served as demonstrations to the Soviets that we could reach out and touch them with our atomic weapons. The 307th was a frequent flyer to Giebelstadt and Fürstenfeldbruck, Germany, for extended temporary duty. The Soviets watched these missions intently. They could see they were falling behind the U.S. rapidly and would soon be unable to close in on its ambitions to take over Western Europe. Stalin accelerated his strategic bomber and atomic bomb development programs. In April 1948, the 307th passed its first operational readiness test, SAC's infamous ORT. It was not all good news. Although the 307th's gunners were rated at 99.5% proficient in meeting SAC's stringent standards, aircraft commanders, pilots, and bombardiers were only at 50%. That was not a rating that would generate praise from soon-to-be SAC Commander General Curtis LeMay. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets decided to do something to get the United States out of Western Europe without going to war. They blocked all rail, road, and canal access to the western zones of Berlin. Suddenly, some 2.5 million civilians had no access to food, medicine, fuel, electricity, and other basic goods. Western powers began an airlift that lasted nearly a year and delivered vital supplies and relief to West Berlin. The Berlin airlift captured the world's attention as it succeeded to keep West Berlin alive, fed, and warm. At its peak, an aircraft landed every 45 seconds at Tempelhof Airport. Less well known, on the 27th of June, the 307th Bombardment Group was placed on 4-hour alert status to deploy for whatever contingency the Soviets might have in mind. On the 16th of July, 30 B-29s from the group deployed to bases in the United Kingdom on what was advertised as a routine training mission. One squadron went to Waddington, the other two went to Marham. But this mission was far from routine. They went with their machine guns fully loaded out. While they did not carry bombs for the transatlantic flight, official announcements pointed out the U.S. had plenty of bombs left over from World War II in England to send the B-29s on strike missions immediately. When they landed on the 17th, the crews were met by local villagers who warmly welcomed them back to bases Americans had occupied during the war. And hundreds of newspaper, radio, and camera reporters swarmed them as they exited the aircraft. Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, at the time commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, told the press that these B-29s would participate in simulated bombing missions across the continent. Military analysts of the day treated this deployment as the first instance of the United States playing its nuclear card. They assumed, as did many later historians, that these B-29s were fully capable of carrying atomic bombs and were the forward elements of an American nuclear strike force moving in to deter the Soviets or to retaliate on Mother Russia if the Soviets were to use the blockade of Berlin as a pretext for an all-out invasion of Western Europe. Whether or not the 307th could have delivered atomic bombs in 1948 is a question we can leave to others to address. But this crisis was a turning point for the 307th. When the group returned to MacDill in September 1948, SAC changed its mission, making atomic bombing its top priority. Sea search and anti-submarine warfare were moved to the bottom of its mission list. And, to begin the process, SAC directed the group to designate 2 crews per combat squadron as atomic bombing crews. The intelligence section started a mandatory training program of 4 hours Russian language and history each week in November. All combat crews went through a long-range escape and evasion program of instruction 2 days a week. In November and December 1948, the group was sent on a simulated bombing mission over New York City, with Manhattan and Idlewild Airport as their designated targets. The public visibility of the 307th culminated in the January 1949 inauguration parade for President Truman, where the 307th's B-29s were the featured climax of an aerial flyover at low altitude down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol Building to the White House. 1949 was a time of upheaval for the airmen of Strategic Air Command. In late January 1949, General LeMay ordered the entire command to fly a simulated radar bombing mission on Wright Air Base in Ohio. The results were appalling. Not one crew flew the mission as briefed. The average error for the 303 missions flown was nearly 2 miles. Then the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, years before U.S. intelligence had predicted. And in October, Mao's Chinese Communist Party chased the nationalists off the mainland to Taiwan and took control of the world's most populous country. Despite the hectic pace for airmen, there was good news for Air Force families in 1949. Congress had become concerned with the lack of adequate housing for families of airmen. In 1949, the Air Force needed 121,000 housing units, but had only 17,954, and 35% of these were substandard. An article in Life magazine highlighted the conditions in military housing of the day: tar paper shacks, chicken coops, plywood huts, with many lacking running water and electricity. So in August 1949, Congress had passed the WWII Act to provide for private sector construction for military families. MacDill Air Force Base was the first location to open so-called WWII housing areas. Those family quarters were just about ready for occupancy at MacDill when the Korean War broke out. There was a long list of families of captains through sergeants slated to begin occupying those quarters in July 1950. MacDill headquarters had to issue a 2-page official memorandum detailing what was to happen if the airman was suddenly deployed overseas. There was no let-up for the 307th in 1950. In mid-February, the 307th once again deployed to the UK for operational training exercises. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, the entire free world took a collective gasp. MacDill Air Force Base was no exception. The 307th was alerted to be prepared to deploy on short notice for a tour of temporary duty with the Far Eastern Air Force of no less than 30 days. The Air Force had recently formed a sister organization at MacDill, the 306th Bombardment Group, which was slated to become a B-50 unit. That mission was changed, and the 306th became a standardization group to push 36 teams of B-29 aircraft commanders, pilots, and flight engineers every month out to Strategic Air Command. With the sudden breakout of war, the Air Force stopped all discharges and retirements, and it recalled to active duty officers who had recently retired. The 306th became a feeder unit, sending men and supplies to fill in vacancies in the 307th. The entire MacDill Air Force Base was placed on accelerated training program 7 days a week. All officers and airmen were required to carry their prescribed individual weapon, helmet, and gas masks at all times while on the military reservation, and all SAC personnel rotated through gas chamber and small arms qualification training in July. The base went to a heightened state of security, with all aircraft and vital fixtures guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At 22:35 Eastern Standard Time on July 31, 1950, the first elements of the 307th departed for Kadena. The B-29s were loaded out with crews and other essential personnel. For some, it was a somewhat festive occasion, with send-offs from high-ranking generals and families of aircrew on the flight line, all smiles as they bid farewell on yet another, quote, TDY. For others, the faces of airmen and their families told a more somber story. At another part of the flight line, support airmen boarded C-54 transport aircraft for what their faces showed they knew was to be an arduous flight. By August, all had arrived at Kadena Air Base in Japan and were almost immediately thrown into the desperate fight that would come to be known as the defense of the Pusan perimeter.